common ground is, to get a real sense of what these concerns are.
Meeting with those protesters. The question is that enough to end the blockade? Joining us now live from question and the rest of the day's developments is ATV's senior reporter Rick Grant. What is the buzz there on the dock? With Minister Reid's promise here on ATV tonight?
Well, Steve, I just finished talking with one of the spokesmen for the blockade, the group that's conducting this blockade, Tim Nickerson. And Mr. Nickerson told me that he's very pleased to have the meeting, but that doesn't mean that this blockade is going to stop. He's somewhat skeptical about anything that they would get from the federal government at this point. Meanwhile, there's been no visible change here on the wharf. 130 fishing boats continue to hem in the Russian freighter, and a convoy of trucks is a little further down the wharf, preventing the ship from unloading its 800-ton cargo of fish. Fishermen here are determined to have the federal government change the rules on foreign fishing. And after Federal Fisheries Minister Ross Reid said he would not discuss the issue until the blockade came down, some fishermen put up Christmas trees on the masts of their boats to send a signal on how long they are prepared to stay here. Others are skeptical of what may be offered by Reid.
Ross Reid there, I guess he is DFO, isn't he?
Yep.
No, I don't trust him. I don't trust him as far as you can throw him, any politician.
As determined as the fishermen are to have changes made in foreign fishing in Canadian waters, the blockade of the Russian freighter has been peaceful. Nevertheless, the RCMP have been monitoring the situation.
Plans today are just to monitor the situation again today. It's our understanding there are meetings ongoing and negotiations are still taking place. Until such time as that breaks down, we're just going to monitor it. As long as it stays peaceful, we have no plans other than just to monitor it.
Meanwhile, aboard the freighter Pioneer Murmena, the captain and crew wait. Captain Vladimir Uverov says he may try to leave tomorrow for Maine if the cargo cannot be unloaded. Uverov says it's all up to his company. His orders for the moment are to stay put. And the fishermen are going to stay put, as well as the blockade, until this meeting between the Federal Department of Fisheries Deputy Minister and the representatives from the blockade is over. Steve?
Now, Rick, this time yesterday we were hearing some noises from DFO that the Mounties might be called in to deal with this thing. Is there any kind of increased police presence there dockside today?
No, the RCMP come by from time to time, but they've been concerned about keeping the laneways open for security and other emergency purposes. Other than that, they say the conduct of the fishermen and their supporters has been very calm, very reasonable, so they haven't increased any presence. They say that unless there's any kind of a problem, there's no reason to do anything other than monitor the situation. They're quite pleased with the way this blockade is going.
Okay, and by way of recap, once again, the blockade people are willing to meet with the Deputy Minister, but the blockade remains despite the meeting.
That's correct. They will meet with the Deputy Minister. They're pleased to have that meeting, but they're not so certain of the outcome that they're prepared to take down the blockade.
All right, Rick, thank you. ATV's Rick Grant live dockside in Shelburne, Nova Scotia tonight. Well, a Federal Fisheries Department briefing session in Halifax today turned into a forum for the organizer of the Shelburne blockade to debate policy with the Regional Director General of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. The Federal Fisheries Minister Ross Reid has refused to talk to those fishermen until they end the blockade. But ATV's Jonathan Kay tells us tonight today's discussion made both the government's and the fishermen's positions quite clear.
At the conclusion of this briefing session on foreign overfishing, which had been planned prior to the blockade, the main organizer of the Shelburne protest took the Fisheries Department to task.
The whole thing, this whole foreign vessel fishery, is pretty as you might make it sound to these people here and trying to make it sound to the public, is a very ugly picture.
I'm not trying to make it pretty. I'm trying to give the facts out as we have them.
The government allows foreign vessels to fish in Canadian waters for species of fish it's not profitable for Canadian fishermen to catch. Canadian officials say every vessel is carefully monitored and takes only what it's allowed. But the fishermen say the department's surveillance isn't as effective as officials think it is.
No, they don't have a clue what's going on out there. I mean, they talk about the gear conflict and stuff. We're living this daily. I mean, they come in and, like I say, they're trying to baffle you guys with paperwork and numbers, and it all sounds good, and it all match up in the computers, but it doesn't match up on the ocean.
Department analysts insist that the only foreign vessels posing a threat to Canadian stocks are the dozen or so now fishing just outside Canada's 200-mile limit on the nose and tail of the Grand Banks that routinely ignore international quota agreements.
It's a threat in terms of the fact that they're fishing over and above the quotas, though the quotas haven't been taken yet, but they're still fishing over and above the quotas. They could be fishing with irregular gear, right? They're not regulated in terms of gear. So it really is too much, and that's really where we have to focus our attention.
Fisheries officials did offer to meet with the fishermen to discuss their concerns, but they insist their protest is based on faulty assumptions. In Halifax, Jonathan Kay, ATV News.
In the meantime, this man, the militant environmentalist Paul Watson, is now only a few kilometers from the tail of the Grand Banks, just outside the 200-mile limit, and he says he's ready for a confrontation. Watson says he plans to chase foreign boats off the Grand Banks. If they won't get out of the way, he'll sink them. The move is designed to spark the Canadian government into taking stronger action to protect fish stocks just beyond Canada's jurisdiction. Watson says he is being monitored by Canadian military patrol planes and thinks the government is warning the foreign fishing boats to stay out of his way. And in the midst of all of this today, National Sea Products has announced more layoffs. 120 workers, this time at the wet fish operation in Lunenburg. They are in addition to the 200 others announced in Lunenburg only a couple of weeks ago. National Sea says it doesn't know when or if those workers will be called back. The company continues to suffer from a shortage of fish to process. Angry lobster fishermen from northern Cape Breton are blocking the entrance to their harbor tonight. They want a share of the lucrative crab fishery, and they want crab license holders forced to hire more crewmen. The blockade has divided the tiny fishing community of Bay St. Lawrence, where some say a crab license is the difference between welfare and making a living. ATV's Fons Jessam tonight.
It's a dispute among fishermen who work from the same harbor. The lobster boats are preventing the crab boats from heading out to the Gulf. So far, there has been no attempt by the crab fishermen to leave the harbor. Snow crab fishermen can catch 50,000 pounds of crab. They can do it in just over a week. The quota and the $2 a pound price make it the most profitable fishery in the area.
Unlike many ports in the region, here in Bay St. Lawrence, the lobster fishery is not a lucrative one. Most of these lobstermen made less than $20,000 this season. They say it is simply too frustrating to try to raise a family on that and watch the man in the boat next to you bring in $100,000 in a little over a week.
Next season is too late for us guys. We've been devastated here. No ground fishery, no lobster fishery. And now, well, obviously no crab fishery because we don't have a license.
If they were spreading it around, hiring a good crew aboard a boat, 5, 6 guys on a boat, you know, what all those guys are doing is just making money and banking it. There's no other industry here.
Most of us have the same bills, sometimes more, when you're lobstering. So it's quite unfair.
Here's a very lucrative fishery that originally was a supplementary fishery that could sustain many more people.
Protesters say the harbor will remain blocked until the Department of Fisheries sets up a program to share crab licenses and quotas more fairly.
65% of the quota has been caught so far, and there's no way that we can make any changes for 1993, but we're always willing to sit down with fishermen.
Some of the crab fishermen support the protest.
Well, I believe all the rest of the fishermen here should have an equal chance as well as, you know, same as the rest of us. We're all equal.
Fishermen here say the protest will spread to other nearby harbors where crab boats work.
They asked that because this is a peaceful blockade, that you come down and you meet with the fishermen without any conditions. Why won't you do that?
Well, the atmosphere that we're in, I'm not convinced it's conducive, unfortunately. What I have done, though, however, is asked my acting deputy minister and her senior officials to go to Nova Scotia tomorrow and to meet with the representatives of the fishermen and to see, with an open agenda, and to see what basis of common ground there is and to start some of the work that needs to be done. And I think that'll be a constructive process.
But if they're going, why won't you?
Well, I think to have a meeting with the minister, I think we need to know that it can be something that gets us all the results that we want. And I think that this process is one that I hope the fishermen will find conducive to getting that preliminary work done.
Let's talk a little bit now about the issues that the fishermen are concerned with, primarily the issue of the foreign fishing fleet. Why do we have foreign fishing fleets fishing in Canadian waters?
Well, we have foreign fishing fleets fishing in Canadian waters for a couple of reasons. First of all, under the law of the sea, which gives us the right to manage the 200-mile economic zone, we have an obligation to give resources that are not being used by Canadian fishermen or fish companies to these other countries. In this case, what we're doing is we're entering into agreements with Canadian companies to access that fishery. Canadian companies have said that they can't do it for either economic or technical reasons. In this case, we've entered into agreements that will provide us in Canada jobs in our fish plants, and most of those are in Nova Scotia. They fish in our waters under our laws with Canadian observers, where we register everything that's caught, and it's under a strict management contract that is agreed to by all parties well in advance.
But do you think now, given the current fisheries crisis, it might be time to start saying no to those kind of partnerships with the foreign vessels?
Well, on one hand, we have the legal obligation under the law of the sea, but on the other, I think it's important that we look at the benefit that we get. We can leave that fish in the water. That would create, on one hand, an obligation for us to make it accessible for other people. Remember that it's that law of the sea that gives us the ability to manage out 200 miles. But secondly, what we are doing here, hopefully, is developing some opportunities for Canadian companies that they can move into these industries. One example is a small fishery for a specific type of shark that the Faroese have been pursuing. We now have a Canadian company that wants to pursue it, so we've told the Faroese that in the future they will not be able to fish it because a Canadian believes that he can develop a market for that fish. So that's the direction that we want to go. I suspect in the future, where we've had a development fishery in turbot, we're going to see some of those changes as well.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the problem of the bycatch. A lot of the local fishermen say that while the foreign fishing fleets may be taking up underutilized species, they also scoop up thousands of tons of cod and haddock, fish that those fishermen, the local fishermen, can't get to anymore. They just have, all of their quotas have been reduced. Shouldn't the foreign fleets be subject to the same kind of drastic quota cuts that they've had to face here locally?
Well, haddock for the most part is to be used as a bycatch, as in the case of the foreign fleets for silver hake, and for some of our fleets in Canada, particularly for cod, but for other groundfish. The bycatch is monitored very closely. The contracts are very specific in the amount of bycatch that can be taken. In the case of haddock, it's 1%. The record till now is that they're taking about 0.5%. We had a situation where the Russian vessel was taking too much of a bycatch, and we ordered it out of Canadian waters last week, specifically in response to these very real conservation concerns that these fishermen and many others have raised.
The fishermen also say in Shelburne and in the surrounding area that the quota they have now, they simply cannot survive on. They need an increase. How do you feel about that?
Well, there's two issues. One is the very real fear and frustration and threat that these fishermen feel. I understand that. I've seen that in my own province, in my own region. They're facing mortgage payments and boat payments, and they're not sure that they can make them. That's caused by a conservation crisis that we see right throughout the region, and one that we're dealing with in a number of processes, including the FRCC, which is in Nova Scotia last week and in Newfoundland this week, which will give me advice on a whole variety of fishing levels and TACs, including haddock and other species. The second is the question of conservation. And ultimately, as Minister of Fisheries, my responsibility is to protect the stock so that it continues to grow and is there for the future. We've seen all sorts of problems with fish management in the past. We've learned a lot about it. I have an ultimate responsibility in that regard, and for me to give more quota than is advisable and that is there is something I simply can't do. Now, is there flexibility within the quota to the management or the fishing plan that has been provided? Is there something else we can do to make it more productive and commercially viable for these fishermen? If that is there, I'm prepared to be flexible in that way. But I do understand the frustration that they're going through, that they feel, that their families feel, that the communities feel. It's not something that in the way other areas have felt it, that's been felt in Southwest Nova. It's something that they're beginning to see, and I have nothing but sympathy for that concern.
The fishermen say they're going to stay right where they are until they're satisfied that change is going to come. How do you feel about their tactics?
Well, as I say, I understand the frustration that's led to this. I do think there are better ways to get the attention of the Minister of Fisheries. In the short period of time I've been Minister, I've met with a number of groups that have similar problems. We're trying to respond as best we can within the crisis that we all face. We've seen the close down of the fishery on the northeast coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. We know that we are going to get scientific advice in the future that is going to give me advice on other decisions that I have to take. That brings pressure on people. This sort of tactic, unfortunately, I think gets a little bit out of hand. I don't particularly want to comment on that. I hope that we can end this and sit down at the table and reach some results. I will do what I can within the bounds of the conservation responsibilities and the law and the respect for other gear species or other gear sectors and other species.
Ross Reed, I thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
When we come back, the story of a girl who drops to the ground without warning. Christy suffers from epileptic seizures.
Now, but the demonstrators have won a meeting with the Federal Deputy Minister of Fisheries tomorrow. ASN's Rick Grant has the latest from Shelburne.
The blockade continues on the wharf and on the water. About 130 boats and 400 people. 800 tons of cod that was due to be unloaded yesterday still sits in the hold of the Russian freighter Pioneer Murmana. However, earlier this evening, Federal Fisheries Minister Ross Reed announced that he's instructed his deputy minister to come to Nova Scotia and meet with fishermen's representatives at an undisclosed location.
To sit down with representatives in the industry and see what it is that the common ground is, to get a real sense of what these concerns are.
It's only a partial victory for the fishermen. Yesterday, Reed swore that there would be no meeting until the blockade came down. But beyond the meeting itself, Reed has promised nothing else.
Does this mean that the blockade comes down?
Well, not quite yet. I'm afraid that with our dealings in the past with the DFO, we would like to be able to take the word and go home. I mean, but we've been burnt too many times, just can't do it.
Meanwhile, aboard the Pioneer Murmana, the captain and crew wait through their 5th night. Captain Vladimir Uvarov says if the fish cannot be unloaded by tomorrow, he may try to leave Shelburne. Each day here has cost the ship's owners $5,000. But fishermen here say that their whole future is riding on the blockade and the outcome of tomorrow's meeting.
Nickerson says there are only 2 items on the table for discussion. New rules for the foreign fishing fleet and some sort of quota for the Canadian fishermen here in the blockade. And he says there's no deadline on how long the talks can last. In Shelburne, Rick Grant, ASN News.
Now, earlier today, the organizer of the Shelburne blockade took on federal fisheries officials in Halifax. The confrontation happened at a media briefing on foreign fishing, a briefing that had been planned prior to the blockade. Gary Diedrich accused federal officials of painting a pretty picture of how foreign vessels operate in Canadian waters.
They don't have a clue what's going on out there. I mean, they talk about the gear conflict and stuff. We're out there, we're living this daily. I mean, they come in and, like I say, they're trying to baffle you guys with paperwork and numbers, and it all sounds good and it all match up in the computers, but it doesn't match up on the ocean.
Fishery officials here also offered to meet with the fishermen to discuss their concerns, but insist their protest is based on faulty assumptions. There is another boat blockade going on in Nova Scotia right now, this one in the Bay St. Lawrence area. About half a dozen lobster boats are blocking the narrow channel to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, keeping crab boats from leaving port. The lobster fishermen are upset about the way crab licenses were handed out. They say lucrative crab quotas should have been divided among more fishermen to spread the wealth around.
If they were spreading it around, hiring a good crew aboard a boat, 5, 6 guys on a boat, what all those guys are doing is just making money and banking it. There's no other industry here.
Here's a very lucrative fishery that originally was a supplementary fishery that could sustain many more people.
65% of the quota has been caught so far, and there's no way that we can make any changes for 1993, but we're always willing to sit down with fishermen.
The fishermen say the blockade will continue until DFO agrees to make changes to the licensing system or until crab season closes in September.
Meantime, there's another fishing confrontation just waiting to happen on the high seas. The ship Cleveland Amory is just a few kilometers away from the tail of the Grand Banks. Its captain, militant environmentalist Paul Watson, says he hopes to create an international incident. Watson says if foreign boats fishing just outside Canada's 200-mile limit don't get out of his way, he'll sink them. Watson wants to spark the Canadian